Okay, so this is the replacement lecture that I promised you guys that I would record. I'm going to try to keep it really short and sweet. And essentially, what we're going to be talking about is the same theme that we've been working on for a couple of classes now, which is how does modernism mutate when it travels from its European origins to various other locations around the globe. So today we're going to be considering some of the changes that take place when modernism arrives in the United States. So, one of the sort of textbook examples for this is always to talk about the Tribune Tower competition. So, we're going to talk about that first. And then we're going to go on to consider the career of a Finnish architect whose name is Eliel Saarinen, who came to Michigan in the 20s. And not only was he a very significant architect, but his son, Eero Saarinen, became a very significant architect as well. So those are the figures that we're going to be talking about in this class. Okay, so this gives you sort of an overview of these figures that we're going to be talking about today. All right, so the Tribune Tower competition occurred in 1922 when a prominent newspaper in Chicago that's still published, called the Chicago Tribune, decided that it wanted to build a new office building. And it decided to do this as a kind of a publicity stunt. And decided to hold a competition and advertise that heavily within the pages of the newspaper. So, actually, one of the things about this competition was that it had great prizes attached to it. And you can see the first, second, and third place prizes that were announced. This drew participants from all over the world. There were over 250 entries from more than 20 different countries. There were 10 firms who were invited to participate as well. So one of the reasons that this is important is because of the date. And you can see that this is a date in which you might expect some modern designs to be submitted. But it's also a date where you would expect to see much more traditional and kind of conservative designs submitted. And the Tribune kept all of the entries. They actually published a book with illustrated plates of all of the entries. And so it sort of provides a snapshot of what architecture was like in 1922. So it's not necessarily that the building itself, as built, is considered so important. And indeed, the competition itself could be seen as sort of a moment in the history of publicity or the history of advertising. It isn't clear that it would necessarily belong to the history of architecture. But the reason why is that you get to see how people were thinking in many different places around the world and responding to the brief at this sort of interesting transitional moment in time. So if we look, for example, at some of the German entries, and you're looking here at illustrations from the book that the Tribune published about the competition. On the left, you see Walter Gropius, who you remember was the lead architect of the Bauhaus, and in fact also the head of the Bauhaus for its most important second period in Dessau. You can see the architect Max Tautz, very modern design on the right. So some of these designs were actually for office buildings that we today would say, oh, that looks like a modernist building. Most of the designs actually that the Tribune received were not this avant-garde. And some of them were actually almost sort of jokes. So Adolf Loos, who you remember, the avant-garde architect from Vienna, actually submitted this sort of stunt drawing with the giant column as the office tower. Bruno Taut, who advocated architecture made of glass, you can see his entry here on the right. There, it sort of just gives you a chance to see how many different people responded to this problem. But in fact, a lot of the designs worked with historical styles. For example, imagine the office tower as the kind of Gothic tower like you might see on a cathedral. So if you look at the Helmley and Corbett entry on the left here, you can see the sort of buttresses and the sort of detailing on the top of the tower that make it look sort of in a Gothic style. And in fact, the building that won first prize, which is Howells and Hood from a New York firm called Howells and Hood. This, in fact, was, of course, the design that was built, actually has that sort of Gothic tracery and also the flying buttresses. In fact, this is in what the Tribune, this was the selected winning design, was this historicist design. So it's not to say that all of the entries were so forward thinking. Many of them were not. The building that was built, of course, is a very beloved icon of Chicago architecture, but it clearly looks to the past rather than to the future of skyscraper design. And this sort of brings us to Eliel Saarinen, who, as I said, was a Finnish architect. And you can see his entry here on the left panel, which actually trims away some of the historical reference. It still uses a step back design, but it's emphasizing the height and the slenderness of the tower's reach. So this came in second place, and many people felt that this should actually have been the first place design, that it was the most successful design in the competition. So as a result, this Finnish architect really came into the consciousness of Americans. So much so that he actually was quickly recruited to come to the US. And he originally settled in Evanston. So it was really rather directly on the success of this competition entry that he came to Evanston. And then he actually moved to Ann Arbor, was a professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. And this is where he was recruited by the Detroit newspaper publisher George Booth to become a founder of the Cranbrook School of Art. So actually, Eliel Saarinen spent the rest of his life at the Cranbrook School of Art, not only supervising the architecture program there, but also extensively building a really huge campus for Cranbrook, and we're going to look at that briefly. So you can think of this design as a kind of an important landmark in the history of modern architecture in the U.S. because this brought Saarinen out of Finland and to the U.S. And I've just put in a couple of slides here that show you these pieces of other buildings embedded in the Tribune Tower, because I think they're one of the most interesting features of this building. These were actually from Colonel McCormick's own collection And he would sort of chip off bits of buildings that he visited, which of course today is completely illegal. And friends actually would send him pieces of buildings as they traveled for his collection, and these are now embedded in the building. Okay, so a few of these competition entries for the Tribune building look modern, but really most don't. Um, and actually, it takes a bit longer for a modern building to be built in the US. One of the earliest is considered to be the PSFS building in Philadelphia, which is a bank, Philadelphia Savings and Loan Society. So um, uh, this building, which you see on the screen here, is considered to be one of the first skyscrapers in the US that actually looks like a modernist design, that is actually emphasizing its materials, its construction, and foregoing reference to historical styles. So we're really not going to talk too much about this building, but you might notice that it actually looks a fair amount like Gropius's proposed design for the Tribune building. It has some relationship to that, and you can see here actually at the bottom this sort of lobby and commercial space element, and then this is all going to be rented office tower space throughout the building. This gives you a sense of what the layouts look like. And the illuminated sign actually is one of, this is a neon sign from the 1920s. It's actually very expensive to maintain today, but it is landmarked. So it's still in the Philadelphia skyline, as you can see from that opening shot that I was showing you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about Eliel Saarinen. He is actually, as I mentioned, from Finland, and he went to school for both painting and architecture at the Polytechnic in Helsinki. And he had several classmates with whom he formed a firm. For a while, they were all extremely close, and they actually decided to locate their firm in the countryside, and they built sort of a communal compound with multiple structures where they lived for about a decade until they parted ways. So we're not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is just sort of showing you the layout of this building, which is going to look like just a very, very large, sprawling single-family home, but is in fact sort of a multi-family compound. And I think you're going to see that it's built in what would be the equivalent in Finland of like an arts and crafts style. So not only does it hark back to an older past stylistically, but it also uses materials that would have to be made by individual craftsmen. So in other words, if you look at this, you can see like the tile roofs, for example. In the interiors, there's a lot of timber. There's a lot of craftsmanship. So it's built in a style that sort of references these historical vernaculars. These are just some different shots of the exterior, but it's also sort of decorated and embellished within an inch of its life in the interiors as well. So this is actually the carriage house, so like the garage, but you can see the use of the stone and the timbering, right? All of this is sort of referencing traditional Finnish vernaculars. This is another little sort of an entrance tower. And I don't have too many shots of the interior, but here you can see the hall where there are sort of handcrafted tapestries hanging from these heavy timbered walls, right? So it kind of gives you a feel, these very elaborate rugs and textiles. And I do have a color shot of this room, which shows you the sort of very carefully controlled color harmonies and the craftsmanship, all of the painting and the tile work and the textile work that are characteristic of this communal living situation that Saarinen was part of, along with Lindgren and Geselius, his partners. This is another view of that same room where you can see these beautiful handcrafted tiles and specially designed lighting fixtures, all the decorative painting, the unusual windows, the textiles, right? So it really gives you a kind of a flavor for what the Finnish version of arts and crafts looks like. All right, so that is actually where Saarinen is living, uh, and um, and working, but he becomes pretty well known throughout Finland. And you can see right here on this list something that we talk about constantly. So the Finnish pavilion, right? We actually were talking about Aalto's Finnish pavilions for an exhibition in Paris in 1937 and for the New York World's Fair in 1939. This is an earlier World's Fair in Paris from 1900, where Saarinen's firm is designing the Finnish pavilion. And I think from looking at the pictures of his house, you're probably getting a sense of some of the characteristics that we can expect of the Finnish pavilion of this time. It's probably going to look to vernaculars and feature Finnish handcrafts, right? So again, you can see why at the time of 1900 that is likely to be the choice for the Finnish pavilion. So we're going to talk about that first. And then I'm just going to show you a few slides of the Finnish National Museum, which is a commission that the firm won on the basis of the Finnish pavilion, and the Helsinki railway station, which again, of course, is modern infrastructure, but is being built in a way that references a historical style. Okay, and just to mention here, Saarinen actually becomes very well known for his town planning. He actually wins second prize again in a prestigious national competition for a new capital of Australia in Canberra, and does projects throughout Finland, which range from as simple as working on traffic calming, traffic flow, traffic islands, to larger downtowns and infrastructure projects. So we're not really going to talk about him as a planner, but I just want you to be aware of that. Okay, so this is obviously just a drawing of the National Pavilion, the Finnish National Pavilion. And again, this is going to be sent to France. This design is going to be constructed in a foreign country for purposes of showing off what Finland is about. So you can see he's sort of working with the tower and this little rounded form. You can see that it is in some ways already starting to feel very Art Deco. So you could contrast this, for example, with Louis Sullivan's Golden Door for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 of the Transportation Building. And here you can see another view. You can also see, I think, the Art Nouveau influences here in the use of organic and irregular forms. This is what one of the interior spaces looks like of this pavilion. Okay, so it's probably not that surprising that doing this great job on the finished pavilion puts the firm up for the job of designing the National Museum of Finland, right? Because once again, what is the brief here? It's to represent what is unique about Finland, and that is thought to reside in these vernacular architectures. So here you can see a very beautiful presentation drawing that the firm created for this job, and then this is an actual photograph of what this looks like as built. So you have, again, the interplay of all these different gables, lots of arches. It's sort of a Romanesque style, a lot of masonry, towers, but it's also detailed in a way that very much refers to these sort of local building materials and motifs. So one of the things that Saarinen does for the National Museum, that's another exterior, is create these sort of little figures that are decorative figures that are embedded throughout the building. So I just want to show you a few of these. So here you can see this is probably from some kind of fable, right? Do you see the squirrel and maybe, I'm not sure if he's a crow or what kind of bird he is. You can see these figures pushing off a boat into the sea. And there are even these little sort of mythical, fabulous figures in the capitals these are interior capitals for supports inside the building, right? So with these little, and these would be identifiable to somebody who knows Finnish folklore, right? So he's very much tying in the decorative program of this building to things that are specifically Finnish. So that should feel very much like that arts and crafts idea, right? It's sort of connecting to the craft traditions and to the past of a specific place. For the railway station, of course, there are a whole set of programmatic demands that are very important that are placed on Saarinen, as well as a decorative conception that he's going to have to come up with. And you can see that he actually is already moving towards a simplified modernism. There's a little bit fewer decorative flourishes. It's more about the massing. There's more use of repetition, right, across to emphasize the span of long elements like the train sheds. And he's also creating this very distinctive, again, if you know any of Sullivan's designs, this is probably going to look very connected to those designs for the entry. So here's another view sort of from down the street. You can see how this building works, but it's becoming considerably simpler in the way that it is planned out. You can see here some external figures that he's designing. And this is just a nice pencil drawing of the interior. This is a photograph of what the interior space looks like as you enter. Okay, so as I mentioned, really following right on the heels of the Tribune Tower competition, Saarinen moves. He moves to Chicago, and he lives his entire life in the Midwest, where he's associated with the Cranbrook School of Art. And I put this link in here, so this is just sort of the school's own page about their history, so it's a helpful summary. if you get interested in this as an institution of higher learning in the US. So I would very much compare this with uh, Gropius starting to teach at Harvard, or Mies starting to teach at IIT, except that it's 20 years earlier, right? We're in the mid 20s rather than in the mid 1940s. So this is all happening earlier uh, in the case of Eliel Saarinen. And the Cranbrook Academy of Art actually is on several hundred acres. It is a huge complex of buildings. It includes many different separate buildings, and actually, there are, for instance, Stephen Hall recently built a building for their campus. So they're always adding on to this marvelous campus. So it's a really great place to visit because it's sort of a who's who. It's a place where you can see a lot of different architecture collected. Much of the original architecture of Cranbrook is by Eliel Saarinen, and you're going to see that he really, he's sort of leaving behind some of the directly Finnish references, which weren't going to make sense in the American Midwest, but he's keeping a lot of the architectural ideas. So we're not really going to have time to look specifically at all of his different buildings that he builds, but I just want to give you kind of an overview. So this sort of shows you one of the older sections of the campus. And this model was actually constructed by his son Eero and his wife at the time, Loija Saarinen. So this is a drawing, kind of an axonometric that shows you. This is a plan that shows you a lot of these buildings. So you can see that actually he's setting up avenues, quadrangles. He's shaping space, right? Not just building buildings. So this is actually giving him a chance to do his urban planning thing within these very controlled campus conditions. So he's building, for example, towers, libraries, schools, workshops, houses. He builds the master's house, which he and his wife live in. Here are some of the teachers' houses. And as time goes on, he is even simplifying more. So this is the arcade at Cranbrook, which I believe is part of the art museum that he designs in the 1940s. But the Saarinen house is sort of the first thing that he designs, and I don't know, do I have a slide of it in here? No, I don't. But that is actually where he lives together with his wife, and this becomes a sort of, it becomes a kind of transition, right, between Saarinen's arts and crafts background in Finland and bringing that kind of sensibility to the US. So very custom designed house at Cranbrook. So now I want to talk a little bit about his son, Eero. So as you can imagine, it's probably pretty hard to have this guy as your dad. Eero is also trying to be an architect, and in fact, one of the sort of famous myths about him is that the same year that his father entered the Tribune Tower competition in 1922, Eero was 12 years old, so he was sort of like an adolescent boy, and he entered a competition that was to build a building out of matchsticks, so it was like a model making kind of a competition. which he won. So family dynamics were probably pretty interesting. But one of the cool things about Arrow is that he really doesn't build in a kind of stark, planar, geometric style as a modern architect. He really brings a kind of a fusion of organic design with modernism. And he makes some of the most iconic buildings and structures in the American landscape. So we're just going to mention these briefly. Kresge Chapel, I don't think we can say is really one of those, but I think it's worth looking at because for a number of reasons. One is it's also on the MIT campus. It's also from 1955. So this is just shortly after Alvar Aalto is building Baker House, which is designed from, I think he starts in 1948. I don't think it's finished until maybe the mid-50s. But also, right, a curvy building built out of brick. So bringing this warmer, more organic modernism to the U.S. And just keep in mind that Aalto, of course, is Finnish as well, but he maintains his citizenship. Eero is born in Finland, and he grows up in that communal compound in the Finnish countryside, Vitrask. This is like his house as a kid. Let's go back here for a second, right? Like this is where he grows up, in this house, along with all these other architects, like the partners of his father. Okay, but then he comes to the U.S. And he actually teaches at Cranbrook as well on his father's faculty. So they're both Finnish, but one is Finnish American, the other is Finnish. Okay, so let's talk about Kresge Chapel just briefly. Small and also I think interesting in terms of just this history of how do we create sacred architecture without referring to historical styles. So you can see here that he's going for this blank, windowless form. The building is round, the building is brick, and he is looking for a very charged experience of light, which he brings in through the oculus, which is up here. And you can see Harry Bertoya's wire sculpture here that is functioning as an altar screen, right? So trying to figure out how to create a sacred moment or a charged experience of space with a spiritual dimension without using traditional church-like forms. In fact, when you get to the inside of this chapel, you can see that the brick is kind of undulating. He is using clinker brick, much like Aalto did, to create warmth and texture. You can see the sort of hidden, recessed lighting that is going to bring out that texture of the brick. So this is a very intimate and small chapel, totally modernist, and trying to figure out how to manipulate space and light to produce this experience of spirituality without using anything historical to tip people off that this is a chapel. So that's the Kresge Chapel at MIT that's completed in 1955. Much more sort of high profile and on the public radar, of course, is his TWA terminal. So this is a big Plum Commission, and this building is actually being expensively restored by Buyer Blinder Bell and brought back to life, which is really great news because it had been largely left unused. This is the TWA terminal at a big airport in Queens that we today call JFK. So if you're doing international flights in and out of New York, this is your airport. At the time, as you can see, it was actually called Idlewild. It was renamed after Kennedy was assassinated. So this airport is being built, obviously, by a large team, right? It is not just Saarinen and Associates. You can see actually a number of other prominent American architects like Kevin Roche of Roche Dinkeloo or Caesar Pelli are on this team, but also there's piles of structural engineers, and you have this marvelous reinforced concrete form with these huge glass walls. So here you're sort of looking at the main entrance, and you can see these massive concrete piers that are sort of supporting this shell. You can see some of the glass curtain walls here. So a really, really delightful building. I have read many critiques of this building, and it's hard not to feel like people are just trying to find that they're just haters, because I don't know how you hate this building. It's a beautiful building. So I that's just my point of view. In any case, you can see here on the screen, and I'll let you read this on your own, sort of description of the concrete, and he does leave the concrete rough, which you can actually kind of see in the slide that the forms are rough and have impressed the concrete. So there's a lot of texture here, very clean lined aerodynamic shape, but there's still a lot of texture here, and you can see people going in. This becomes like the overhang that is protecting the drop-off point. When you get inside, of course, you have these really sort of marvelous, fun, optimistic 1950s organic modernism, and trying to create this kind of image, both of flight and of futurity. And you can see that the circulation is sort of swooping all over the place. All of this was, it doesn't really show up, the forms show up beautifully in the black and white slide, but the color, he's using bright red carpet for all of this, and building in these marvelous little lounges that you can see in these views where you're watching the airlines come and go. So this definitely belongs to a moment of a sort of optimistic, idea about future transportation and the glamour of jet travel, which can seem, I think, very far away at the present moment. But some really exciting architectural moments in this building. This is one of the sort of business spaces connecting that terminal to the actual gates. Okay, so Saarinen also gets another very, and by the way, he does a lot of airports. He also does, famously, he does Dulles, which I think today they call it Reagan. I don't know. Somebody who flies in and out of DC can correct me on that. But I don't think it's called Dulles anymore, or maybe it is. I don't know. In any case, in St. Louis, Saarinen wins the competition for the Gateway Arch, also known as the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. So the idea of this is to find a symbol and sort of uh, to emphasize St. Louis as this idea of the gateway to the West. In practice, the siting of this arch actually cut the park off from the downtown. So there was a recent redo of this, which is apparently much more successful, which actually connects downtown St. Louis with the Mississippi waterfront where the arch is located. And sort of restores the connection so that it's much easier to access and enjoy as a pedestrian, is actually connected to the downtown. So that over the past couple of years is something that happened. Here you can see, it's a little hard to see. This bridge is actually a great place to see the arch from. This is the bridge. If you come from Illinois, you'll be coming right across this bridge into St. Louis. And you can kind of see here, although you can't see the water, but this site is right on the water. And there are two key things that I really want us to focus on about the arch, but rather than me lecturing about them, I thought I would just sort of throw them out there. And then ask you to take a look at this piece, which is short and journalistic. It's not hard to read, describing what a catenary arch is. This, of course, is a form that Gaudí was using at the turn of the century, and it shows up here again in Saarinen work. And also, she's talking about the stainless steel cladding, sort of saying those are kind of the two most striking things about this, is that form and that sort of shiny stainless steel. It's very reflective of light. It's very eye-catching. So trying to understand those two choices and how a certain kind of illusion is produced using those. And let me just also mention, I think we will try to talk about this in class on Monday, that, he's choosing something that is different from a typical memorial, right? It's not an obelisk like the Washington Monument. It doesn't have a colonnade, a classical colonnade like the Lincoln Memorial. It doesn't have a dome like the Jefferson Memorial, right? So it's using a form that is seen as sort of more advanced and sort of space age type of a form, although it is an arch, which of course is a traditional architectural form going back to the Romans. So I think we'll try to talk a little bit about that contrast on Monday. Okay, thanks everybody.